It's an honor to be here to sort of give some representative overview of some of the work that's going on here. I don't know that this is necessarily a representative overview of what's going on during our program at the INI, but this is at least some sort of a snapshot of some of the things that my students and I and my collaborators are thinking about. I should also say that this talk is for people with a very short attention span, so somewhat unlike Sergio's, it's just going to move from topic to topic, because my goal is to tell you, here's a problem that we've looked at, here's what the problem looks like, and we have a solution, and then I'll move to the next problem. And I think, well, I don't know, in pop music we have these notions of mega mixes that just sort of fade in and out from one thing to the next, so this talk will be just like that. Okay, so this is joint work with various people who I will introduce as I go along. They're written in the order of how they, the order of when they got involved in this work on network science, network data science. Okay, so here are some of the problems that I'm roughly going to be talking about in this talk. I will go into these in more detail, but some things we might want to know is if we have data that are collected with some kind of underlying network structure, and we don't know the network structure, how do we use the data to infer something about the network structure? Another thing is if we have something that's spreading over a network, whether it's a disease or some kind of information, maybe people are connected in a social network, how do we predict where it's going to go? How do we stop it from spreading? Or how do we make it spread as much as possible? Another question that's also of interest in our research group is if we have a network like the web and we want to do some kind of search over it by maybe clicking from website to website, we want to detect something. Like maybe what is the website with the most uses of the word mathematics, then how would we do this in some somewhat efficient way? Okay, and so when people talk about network science these days, they're often also interested in these kinds of dynamic networks, where networks are getting bigger and bigger with more and more users joining, and so you also want to understand the evolution properties of a network. Okay, so I just have a very short prelude, which is about graphical model estimation, because I think in statistics it used to be the case, and maybe still is, that when you talk about networks, people talk about graphical models, because this is something that I think we understand quite well mathematically. So I'll just mention very briefly, well, what did I used to think that network science was about in the statistical sense? Well, the idea is you have some kind of a matrix of data, so maybe it's some kind of genetic data. And the goal is to get from your matrix of data to some sort of a network visualization. Or maybe you have some matrix of data where your data are collected from electrodes that are implanted in a brain. And again, you want to get from some matrix of maybe time series data to some kind of visualization of how things might be interrelated or at least working together. Okay. And I think some of us have spent some time thinking about what are the mathematical fundamentals that allow you to get from this sort of data matrix to this kind of graph picture? Like, what sort of assumptions should you have on the underlying way in which the data are generated? So there's a lot of nice mathematical theory in the case when all of the entries in your matrix come from a jointly Gaussian distribution, and then the graph that you get corresponds to an inverse covariance matrix. However, as you know, in real life, you would hope that everything is Gaussian, but they're not always Gaussian. So hopefully you can do some kind of transformation and make things more Gaussian. But then the problem is that what if you have count data? Well, then things aren't Gaussian, so no matter what you do, you're not going to make it into a Gaussian distribution. So I spent some time a couple of years ago thinking about what kind of mathematical fundamentals there might be behind when graphical model estimation works in the case of count data. Okay, but life is more than network estimation, and that's what I learned from my first student, Justin Kim. So the first topic is on statistical inference, and I'll just say this is the overview of our mega mix. So as you see, I'm going to talk about 6 different problems in half an hour. So I'll just sort of frame the problem and explain it. And I'm happy to discuss any of these problems that might be at all related to what you're thinking about right now. All right. Okay, so statistical inference. So statistical inference, well, I've kind of split it into 2 parts. One has to do with what we call confidence sets, and one is hypothesis testing. So in statistics, confidence intervals and hypothesis testing are very fundamental topics that we learn in the first statistics class. And sort of the question is, what if we have data that are collected on a network. How does that interface with this idea of confidence intervals and hypothesis testing? Okay. So for the problem of confidence intervals, we were looking at a problem that had to do with information that is diffusing over a network. So like I said, maybe we have a known network structure of people in a social network, and we know how they're connected to each other. And therefore, if we know that at some point a lot of people have liked some topic, then that means that they must have learned about it from each other. Right. So the question is, at some point, you know who in your social network has liked something just by looking at their neighbors and who likes what and deciding like or not. And the question is, how do you figure out where it came from? Or in a completely different setting, maybe you are looking at infections and they've spread over some network of people, and you know that these particular people have interacted with each other. Maybe they live in the same city, or maybe they live in cities that are connected by roads. And if they're not connected by roads, they wouldn't have been able to travel to each other anyway. Right? So you know who in the network is infected, and you want to figure out where it comes from. Okay, so as I said, we wanted to think about some notion of confidence intervals. So confidence intervals in statistics are sort of a generalization of a point estimator. So a point estimator is where you just pick out one parameter or one node. So instead, we're interested in picking out some confidence interval. So the idea is, maybe if I were only allowed to pick one parameter, then you can talk about maximum likelihood, you can talk about the probabilities of that being the correct parameter, but maybe you want to be correct with some error tolerance of 5%, right? You want some sort of a set of points, in this case a set of nodes, that with probability at least 95% contains the source. So our goal was to understand, well, first of all, what are some sort of mathematical models of disease spreading over a network for which we can mathematically say that this is the way you construct a confidence set, so that with probability at least 95% it contains the source. All right? So again, I'm not going to go into the details, but sort of the basic idea is that we looked at a case where the underlying network is a tree, where it has a very regular structure, and where the method of transmission is just sort of on the next step, each node is equally likely to be the next one to be infected. All right. So basically, in order to derive these valid confidence sets, we need to lay down some mathematics. So we have a method of what does our tree look like, and how is the disease spreading. Okay. And we're also interested in the question of how big does the set have to be? Because if I asked you, give me a set that with probability at least 95% contains a source, you could say, everything. But that's not particularly helpful. So you want to see what is that size, maybe a minimal size of a set that could contain the source. And so it turns out for the types of mathematical models of propagation we looked at, actually we showed mathematically that the size of the set does not actually have to grow with the size of the number of individuals infected. So at some level, it's saying that the information about where the disease started is concentrated near the source. So for instance, you might say, well, if I want a 5% error tolerance, I need to pick out 6 nodes. If I want a 2% error tolerance, I need to pick out 20 nodes. But that doesn't matter as the disease continues. And I should again say that this is a property of the particular types of spreading models that we studied. Okay. So maybe just because this is nice to show in pictures, what do our methods look like for constructing these confidence sets? Well, in some sense, we want to choose nodes that are very central to the graph, right? Because everything is spreading sort of symmetrically. So if you were just to look at this, you would say, I want to pick out that node, right? And then you would say, well, if I told you you want to pick out the 4 most central nodes, then I don't know, these 4 look most central. But we need a way of ranking the nodes in such a way that we can pick the ones that are most central and rank order them in that way, right? So the way that we rank order the nodes is, well, pictorially, we take each node who is infected, and we cut up the tree of infected nodes. So it's like you can disconnect this node U from all of its neighbors. Then you end up with a couple different trees, and you look at the maximum size of that. So in this case, this is the biggest subtree, and it happens to have 8 nodes, so we say that this thing has a score of 8. And you can imagine if I were looking at this node out on the end, then the score of this node would be n minus 1, right? Because what I would do is I would cut off this node from all of its neighbors, and then I would just have one giant tree, and that would be really big. So you compute these scores for all the nodes, and then if you want to find the most central node, you find the one with the minimum value. If you want to find 5 nodes that are the most central, then you use a scoring method, and you calculate those 5 nodes. So if you want to think about the computational time of this, like how scalable is this, you can run this algorithm in order n, where n is the number of red nodes in the graph. So then we wanted to prove, of course, mathematically that this actually works. And I think this is the only theorem I have in this talk because it's sort of not too bad to look at. So basically the theorem says that as long as our tree is constructed in such a way that every node has at least 3 neighbors, then in fact this method works, where the number of nodes you need to pick out for an error tolerance of epsilon is some function of the tree structure, the number of neighbors, and epsilon. And in particular, it's not growing as the number of infected nodes grows. So that's the main result. And just a small remark is that if D, the number of neighbors, is 2, then this result doesn't hold, which kind of opens up a whole box of, why doesn't it hold when you're spreading on a line versus spreading on a tree that is, has more neighbors? We don't really have a great explanation other than intuitively, if you have a disease that's spreading on a line, information is diffusing really, really fast. Whereas if you have a graph that has more neighbors and a lot of fronds, then maybe it's not spreading as quickly, so the information about the source is very concentrated. Okay. So as I said, that's the end of the story, and I'm going to move on. I'm not talking about the details of how we did this. I will say that we were able to generalize these results a little bit. So in practice, it would be very interesting to study much more general graphs, not just trees, because Facebook graph is definitely not a tree. But mathematically, we're trying to come up with very concrete statements that say, with probability 1 minus epsilon, you have the source, right? So we started from a very simplistic structure with a very simplistic tree, and we can generalize this a little bit when you have a tree where the number of neighbors of each node are drawn from some fixed distribution. We can't say anything about graphs. We think that probably if you had some network which isn't a tree and you have information on who's infected, maybe you could draw a maximal spanning tree or a minimal spanning tree and run the algorithm. And probably it would work, but we haven't proved anything. Okay, so that was topic 1. So some attempt at seeing what confidence intervals might look like in a graph setting. Okay, so the second question that we looked at, it has to do with hypothesis testing, another important thing in statistics. So the question here, well, first of all, what does hypothesis testing look like when you have information on graphs? Well, it could mean lots of things. In our case, we're trying to do a hypothesis test between different graphs. So maybe to link this to graphical model estimation, in that case, you don't have a candidate graph. You just have a data matrix. You have lots of data, and you draw a graph. So in this case, we have different graphs, and we think that maybe the information spread according to one of these graphs. So in the first case, everybody is basically exchangeable and symmetric. Everyone interacts with everybody else. Maybe in the second case, there's some central individual who interacts a lot with everybody else. And then the other people don't get a chance to interact with each other. So we have some hypothesized graphs. And the question is, if we know who has the information or who has the infection, can we use this information to go back and infer something about which graph was the most likely? All right. So the type of information we have is maybe we just have one snapshot of the data. So one example I like to give is maybe we want to understand how Ebola spread in Africa, right? And we were wondering, does it just kind of spread through the air? Everybody randomly can get it from everybody else. Does it spread from contact? So maybe there's a particular road network between cities, and we think that it spread according to people moving between those cities. All we know is who was infected at a particular timestamp, all right? Okay, so I've drawn stuff in such a way that the middle graph does not look very likely, because if things spread by contagion, then this graph would not happen, because the only way for one node to get the infection from another would be through the central node, right? So to make things a little bit harder and maybe a little bit more realistic, we looked at a case where we also have censoring. So maybe it's not clear whether or not a particular individual has the disease or not. So our observation tells us that these 5 individuals have the disease. This one definitely doesn't, and these 2 we don't know. And then in that case, the middle graph is maybe plausible, because maybe we just didn't know that gray central node had the disease, and actually it did, and the disease spread through that hub. Okay. So hypothesis testing is based on a test statistic. So what do we do? So let me tell you what the test is, and then I'll say a tiny bit about the mathematical framework that we placed down. So imagine that I told you you have information about who has the disease, and you want to come up with some test statistic that summarizes something. Well, there aren't really too many things you could do. So one thing we tried to do was we said, well, let's count the number of edges between the red nodes. All right, because that, if it's spread according to a graph, then probably the infected individuals are more connected to each other. So in this case, you see that the test statistic you get is considerably larger from the other two. So that might suggest that the disease may have spread according to this graph. Okay, so our test statistic is the number of edges between the infected nodes. Now, what constitutes a hypothesis test? A hypothesis test tells you that you have a rejection rule. For some level alpha of type 1 error, you want to figure out what is the threshold so that if t is bigger or smaller than this threshold, then I reject or don't reject the null hypothesis. Okay. So now, well, a little bit, okay, so in order to actually say that this works, we need a mathematical model. I can't just say we have a bunch of graphs. I need to tell you how is the disease spreading over the graphs, because depending on how the disease is spreading over the graphs, it's going to make a difference about whether the test I will propose actually makes sense. So just one small slide on the infection model. So the infection model is basically saying that that every node, if it waits long enough, is going to contract the disease at some rate lambda. So exponential random variables are like a waiting time until something happens, right? So every node, if it waits long enough, will contract the disease. Then we have some other exponential random variables, and these are on edges. So it's saying if someone has the disease, then then its neighbor is going to contract the disease as well, all of its neighbors independently, if they wait long enough. And the amount of waiting time is going to be another exponential random variable along all of the neighboring edges. So the time when an individual becomes infected is going to be the minimum of the time that it would have been infected if it just sat there by itself, and the amount of time it takes for any one of its neighbors to get infected and then infect itself, and then infect that node. So that's why we have this TU and then the TUV. TU is how long does it take its neighbor to get infected and then to transmit the infection. Okay, so that's basically the mathematical framework. This is what we assume. And in particular, in some sense, this is a very symmetric method of infection. So every node has the same exponential random variable, well, the same parameter for how long it needs to wait. And every edge has the same parameter for how long it takes for the disease to spread. Okay, so this motivates a permutation test. So what is a permutation test? Well, a permutation test is a way, it generally happens when you have some data that are sort of exchangeable. And so the idea is you only have one shot at what your data looks like. And so you can try to construct some kind of a distribution by repermuting all of your data and recomputing the test statistic on everything. And that's why it's important that in our assumptions, everything was kind of exchangeable, right? So imagine that your null hypothesis is that everybody is completely connected, then the infection rates of every node are just completely exchangeable with everybody else. Because we have all of these edge parameters that are all homogeneous, and we have these node parameters that are all homogeneous. Okay, so with all of that said, so what is the permutation test? So the permutation test says we have one shot of who is infected and who is not. Okay, and we can compute a test statistic. Great, t equals 0. Now what do we do? Well, we need some sort of a distribution. So it would be awfully nice to say we have a distribution and let's chop off the alpha tail and that's our threshold, right? But we don't have a distribution. This is the problem, and that's where permutation testing comes in. So permutation testing says I want to construct some distribution so I can chop off the alpha tail. So I'm going to repermute all of the data I have since I only have one shot. So I'll just repermute it in all of the possible ways. There are more than 3, but I'll just repermute them in a bunch of ways. I'll recompute my test statistic. And in sort of in the general case, I'll end up with some kind of a distribution. All right, so the permutation test says, construct this distribution, maybe using all of the permutations, or if I have computational, if I have a limitation of computational resources, I'll just draw some large number B of random permutations and approximate whatever this histogram should be. All right, so then I look at this, I say I wanted a 95, well, I want type 1 error to be bounded by 5%. So I look at the upper quantile here, corresponding to 5%. That tells me the threshold, and then do I reject or not? Well, I go back and I look at what my test statistic was for the actual data. I look at where that is relative to the threshold, and then in this case, I don't reject the null. All right, so that's the idea behind how the test works. So you just look at your one shot of data, you repermute everything, and then you compute all the possible values of the test statistic, and you chop off the tail, and then you make your inference. So yeah, I'm just going to skip the theory. So there are results under which it holds, and these results have to do with, basically they have to do with the underlying symmetries of the graph. Maybe one way to put it is that if everything were completely symmetric, like in the case of this graph, then the permutation test kind of makes sense. You know, you repermute your data, everybody is acting the same way anyway, so you get some nice distribution of how things should look if you had a random spread on that graph. So we want to generalize this a little bit more. Like, what if your null hypothesis looked like that, and your alternative hypothesis looked like that? And so under particular conditions on how these two graphs play off against each other, this permutation test will work. So what I have on this slide is just some conditions under which the permutation test will work, and it has to do with these symmetries of the graphs. So there are these sets of symmetries called graph automorphisms, and we need to understand how they play off against each other. And that's all I'll say about that. I guess I lied. There was another theorem on my slides. All right, great. So that's the end of that. So I should say that maybe the open directions here are, you know, I suggested some methods that one might come up with null and alternative hypotheses. You know, oftentimes it might make sense to have one hypothesis that's just everybody is completely connected and completely symmetric, and then another one is this is the spread this is the way I think things might have spread. Another way of constructing null and alternative might be that there's a particular network, maybe a biological network that people have hypothesized, and then you think that there should be an extra connection, or you think that one connection shouldn't be there. Then those could be your null or alternative. But in general, maybe you want to have some multitude of hypotheses and tests between them. So there are lots of other interesting questions you could ask. All right. So now we'll get to the second part, which is divided, I think, into 3 parts. So again, get ready to have your attention go all over the place. So I'll talk about some problems in resource allocation. And these problems will have more to do with optimization and less to do with statistics or statistical inference. Okay. And I should say, so in order in which people got involved, so my colleague Varun Zog also got involved in the first project with Justin. Then Ashley is a first-year electrical engineering PhD student at Madison. And then there's a visiting student at Madison who sort of wandered in my door one day and wanted to do some work. So he's visiting the electrical engineering department, and he also became involved in some of these network-related problems. And I couldn't find a picture of him online. All right, so resource allocation. So the first problem that I worked on in resource allocation has to do with this problem of influence maximization. So in influence maximization, well, in general, resource allocation, we have a certain amount of resource budget that we want to allocate to something, in this case the nodes on the graph, in such a way that something good happens. So in this case, we want to maximize our influence. We have maybe a certain amount of budget that we can use to influence the seed users, the initial users, and we're hoping that they will then influence their neighbors to also adopt the product. Okay, so basically, over time, more and more people adopt the product, and they are only allowed to spread over a graph. Remember, we're interested in this sort of graph-structured data. So the question is, if we can influence k nodes initially, so if our budget is size k, then who should we select in order to maximize the information spread? All right, so mathematically, there is some mathematical model for how the information is spreading in a probabilistic way. The objective function is the expected number of nodes that are infected at the end of time as things continue to propagate. Okay, so in addition to asking how do we maximize over all possible subsets of size k, another question we want to ask is how do we find this subset efficiently, right? Because we probably, if the graph is very large, we don't want to iterate over or try to calculate this value for all possible subsets of size k. Okay, so well, I'm just going to say a little bit about one spreading model that we studied, which is relevant to this problem, and also a problem that I'll mention in a little bit later. So, of course, you know, the answer to this question depends on how exactly is the disease spreading over the network. It probably also depends on what the network looks like. But at least for this mathematical model I'll describe, it's just a model for how the disease or the information is propagating. So this model is called the linear threshold model. It's a special case of another model that's in general called the triggering model. But the idea is that it's parametrized by these edge weights. So we have a graph, and I've written down the edge weights in black. So I'm going to reveal them slowly. So let's take those away so it's less confusing. All right. So there are edge weights sitting on each edge. Something probabilistic is happening. So the probabilistic thing that's going on is that at the beginning of time, each node draws a uniform at random number, and that says what its immunity is. Okay, so it's like, how resistant are you to getting the disease from your neighbors? How resistant are you to getting the information, being influenced by your neighbors? So at the beginning of time, some subset of nodes are influenced, and then on each successive time step, each node that's not red looks at its neighbors and says, are any of my neighbors red? If not, I don't care. If they are, let me sum up the incoming edge weight from all of my neighbors. And if that happens to exceed my my threshold of immunity, then I'll become infected as well. Okay, so going from this step to this step, well, this node said, okay, I might get infected, so let me look at my neighbor. And the total edge weight was 0.4, which is why I only wrote down the 0.4. And my threshold was 0.3, so I should get infected and turn red. Right, then on the next step, these two nodes say, oh, look, well, I might get infected, so let me check whether the incoming edge weight is high enough. Incoming edge weight is 0.2, it's higher than 0.1, so I'm going to become infected, and same with this node. All right, and then I've drawn stuff in such a way that the infection actually stops. So at this point, there's only one node that could turn red. This node looks at its neighbor and says the incoming edge weight is 0.5, and it's smaller than my threshold, so yay, I'm going to stay blue. And then on the next steps, nothing else happens. All right. So as I said, something probabilistic is going on. What's probabilistic? On the next round of infection, what happens is all the black edge weights stay exactly the same, because those are the parameters of the distribution. But then all of the nodes redraw their level of immunity. Okay, so they redraw their level of immunity between 0 and 1, and then if you map out what this infection is doing, it might spread in a very different way. Okay, so that's the probabilistic method in which information is diffusing. And then you can actually say, if I infected that node at time 0, what is the expected scope of the spread if I keep on running it, if I keep on redrawing my node thresholds? Okay, so yeah, I'm going to go through this very quickly. So if we want to do better than searching over all subsets of size k, well, one thing we could do is we could say, let's say I want to influence 3 nodes. So I'll just look at the entire graph and I'll say, well, if I could not influence one node, which one would I influence? And maybe you could calculate that. You would just need to search over all possible n nodes as the initial influencer. Then you say, well, if I could add one more node to this set, which one would I add? So you search over the remaining n minus 1 and you add that one to the set, and then you continue, right? So that's a greedy algorithm. But we want to say, how close is the greedy algorithm to the actual method that searches through all subsets of size k? Okay, so for people who work in discrete optimization, there's this notion of submodularity, which basically is the sufficient condition under which a greedy algorithm does pretty well. So I'll just say, sort of, fact is that if your function, in this case, the function maps the subsets of nodes to the expected number of nodes that are infected, if that mapping happens to be submodular, which it does in this case, then a greedy algorithm works pretty well. Okay, so, but the only problem is that running a greedy algorithm for this problem involves approximating the influence function on every step. So for instance, if I just wanted to find the first node, right, the node that I would pick if I just could pick one node, I could search over all n possibilities, but how do I evaluate what's the expected number of nodes that are infected at the end, right? And so what people had done before is to just simulate it, because I know exactly what my graph structure is. I know what the edge parameters are, so I can just redraw these node thresholds on each round, do it 1,000 times, average out and say, well, on average, this one affects 3.8 nodes. On average, this one does 2.7, blah, 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 right? But you can see how computationally this could become challenging, especially if you have a large graph. So our goal in this project was to say, can we do a little bit better, right? We still want to get a set of size k that is approximately the best thing to do, but we don't want to run through all these expensive simulations of trying to evaluate, if I pick this node, then on average, how many will it infect? Okay, so skipping through many, many, many details, what we did was we came up with some upper and lower bounds for this influence function. So the influence function is the thing that we don't want to compute because it involves expensive simulation. We came up with closed form expressions for functions that are very close. So it's like surrogate functions to the influence function. Then we also showed that, that these functions have this nice property that means that if you run a greedy algorithm, just evaluating this function, you'll get an approximately good solution. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's what happened. And of course, it's much faster. So this is just a nice picture saying that, that things are faster if you don't have to do expensive simulations every time you're evaluating whether or not to pick a node. Okay, so now very quickly, what else have we done in the problem of budget allocation or resource allocation? So this is a project that my student Ashley is currently working on. It's sort of related to the problem of influence maximization in the sense that we want to influence some set of source nodes, and we need to allocate the budget along a set of nodes, and then we want to figure out how can we maximally influence whatever we care about. So source is this, target is this. We want to choose some subset of nodes in the source set that will maximally influence the target. The difference here is that we're allowed to allocate a budget. So maybe we have a budget of size 5, and we put 2 units on this node and 3 units on that one, and 0 on the other ones. Okay, so mathematically, we have these resources to allocate. Ys is some vector that's allocated over the nodes in S. And then we, of course, want to compute some kind of objective function, right? So we want to maximize something subject to the fact that our budget is constrained to a particular size. And then the way that we build the objective function is, again, the expected number of nodes that are influenced. And the way that budget allocation is set up, the idea is that if this has a budget of size 2, it has 2 opportunities to independently influence any of its neighbors. All right, if this one has size 3, that means it has 3 opportunities to influence. And so this is the probability that a particular target node is influenced by any of its neighbors. Right, so it's 1 minus the probability that it isn't influenced. And the probability that it isn't influenced has this exponential in y because that's the number of independent tries I have to influence the guy. All right, so overall, we want to maximize the expected value of the nodes, which is the sum of the probabilities, such that we have some sort of a budget constraint. Okay, so this is a problem that people have looked at. It also happens to have a nice submodularity property. But we were interested in a robust variant of it. So the robust variant of it says, well, in practice, I want to solve this problem, and it depends on what the edge structure is. And it depends on what these probabilities are, right? But maybe in practice, I don't even know if this edge is there. I don't know if these people are connected in this way. Or I don't know exactly what the probability is of influencing. So then what do I do? So we looked at a robust optimization framework. And in robust optimization, you have a min and a max, right? So you want to say, I still want to maximize things, but I want to maximize it even in the worst case. So I look at the minimum over all possible values of these parameters. So that could correspond to different graph structures, that could correspond to different edge probabilities, and then I want to say, how can I maximally allocate the budget even in the worst possible setting? Okay, so this is sort of still work in progress. Again, I want to figure out some efficient algorithm. I want to solve this problem at least approximately, and I want to do it in some efficient manner. And some of the ingredients that we're looking at are, well, it's a maximum of a min of submodular functions. Furthermore, in this case, it's like we have a budget that we can allocate, and there are integer values that we can put at each node, but those aren't just constrained to 0 or 1. So it's a bit different from influence maximization, because in influence maximization, you just get to put in one amount of resource. Here, you can put in maybe 1, 2, 3, etc. So there are some new mathematical ingredients we need to look at. Okay. Yeah, and I think I'll probably wrap up with this slide instead of going to the local search, because I think I'm running out of time. So what's the last problem on resource allocation? So the last problem has to do with, well, okay, maybe it doesn't really make sense that you just want to influence people. Maybe you want to actually stop the epidemic, right? So maybe these are diseases and you want to stop it. So what do you do? Okay, so well, what people have looked at in mathematics for immunization is basically I want to intervene at particular nodes or edges to cut up the graph as much as possible. Because if I manage to cut up the graph into small chunks, that means that even if the disease spreads as much as possible in each chunk, it can't spread so much. But we're interested in a problem where you can't actually cut up the graph. So it's like fractional immunization. I can try to intervene on a particular node or on a particular edge to sort of decrease the propensity to spread. But I can't say that it definitely will not spread. So the question we have is we have resources to allocate to the nodes or to the edges of a graph, And using this framework of influence maximization, we want to come up with a reasonable optimization problem that will tell us who should we intervene at in order to retard the spread of the epidemic. So there are lots of ways you could look at this, but since we were looking at influence maximization, we put it in the influence maximization framework. So there's a budget, and the budget is telling us the total amount at which we can intervene at the edges of the graph. And the reason why I went through this linear threshold model in so much detail was that, if you remember, the linear threshold model was parametrized by the edge weights. So the point is, I can change some fraction of the edge weights in the graph. I can alter each edge by some amount theta ij and make it smaller so that the amount of infectivity gets reduced by theta ij. But I can only intervene on a total amount of sum of the theta ij's is less than b. Okay, and then what am I trying to look at? Well, I'm trying to retard the epidemic. So I want to say that even if I chose the worst case set of influencers in the new network, then that's going to be as small as possible. Okay, so we're still working on this. It's a really, really nasty problem, but it's sort of an interesting optimization problem and certainly potentially very useful. And some of the challenges that we're coming up against is that, well, it's a bi-level optimization problem. There's an inner optimization and an outer one. It also has discrete and continuous variables. So the theta ij's are continuous valued. Then there's this sort of discrete optimization. We want to choose a subset of size k, so it gets a bit more nasty. Something else is, even if you were to run some kind of alternating procedure between the discrete and the continuous thing, let's say you did greedy algorithm and then something like gradient descent, you can't even compute gradients of this influence function. So it leads to some very interesting questions in stochastic optimization, sort of approximating these gradients using some samples from the data. Okay, so I'll wrap up there. We'll skip the local algorithms. I hope you've been entertained at least and maybe introduced to some of this work. The summary is that, well, I think by working with my students, I realized that life is more than graphical model estimation, although I still like that topic. The problems that I've covered span statistics optimization and just algorithmically, how do you do things in a computationally tractable manner. And I think you can see that in all of these problems, if the network were bigger, then, well, I mean, we're trying to do computationally tractable things because if your network is small, you can search over everything. If it's big, then you have a little bit more of a problem, and you need to be a bit more clever about how you search. So thanks for your attention.
Maybe we can have the teamwork now, and we'll come back in 15 minutes for the next session. So is it okay to leave a question for? And let's thank the two speakers again.